That's right. This is the right time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. No Bomani Jones. You got Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell in today. We are presented by Progressive Insurance. Lots of NBA news today. Tons of NBA news. So a good day to have Nick Friedell, our buddy, who's used to covering the train wreck that is the Chicago Bulls, spreading his wings and getting to talk about some successful teams or were successful. We'll see how all these moves affect the Rockets, the Clippers, and the garbage fire that's the Knicks. It's time for Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless. Best phones, best networks, no contracts. So the big news, Nick, obviously, the Clippers have traded Chris Paul to the Rockets. And at first it seemed like, wow, Chris Paul, what a great guy. You know, he was going to be an unrestricted free agent if he didn't re-up with the Clippers. And instead of just leaving them with nothing, he told them he wanted to go to the Rockets. They get to make a trade. They bring back a bunch of pieces in exchange for him. He really did good by LA. And then you realize that, in fact, by re-upping with the Clippers and having them trade him to the Rockets, he then gets to keep his bird rights. And next year, he'll be in the same position he was in this year, where he has a potential to make that giant, about $205 million 5-year deal with the Rockets if he wants to. So really smart move by Chris Paul here, Nick.
Sir, it pays to be at the head of the Players Association.
Right. He knows the CBA back and forth.
That's right. It pays to be at that table. It pays to be one of the main voices that the union listens to, and it's something that Chris Paul had to have known in the back of his mind was possible. At first blush, when you see what happened, you go, okay, maybe this makes sense for the long haul, what's going to happen with his contract, but you're exactly right. The money's going to be there. And as always, it seems in these last few years, the player has so much more of a say than he ever has before in this league. And Paul knew that the Clippers were going in a different direction. He saw a chance to get over to Houston. I think he made that very clear to the Clippers officials in the last couple days. And not only now is he on what serves to be a much better team this season, but he's going to get every bit of those dollars that are coming his way.
So it's Beverly Williams, Decker Harrell, Kelly Liggins, Quarterman, and a 2018 first to the Clippers for CP3. There's a small protection on that first-round pick. So obviously Chris Paul, incredibly dynamic player, by far the best defensive point guard that's out there. Based on ESPN's Real Plus Minus, he was the NBA's second most productive player on a per-minute basis last season, behind only LeBron James. So if you have forgotten how great of a player he is, or if you hold against him the fact that he hasn't been able to, alongside his compatriots, lead the Clippers past the second round, you put him in a new situation, and it could be an incredible pickup for the Rockets, except to say, Nick, I'm kind of interested in how this affects what we now know as the magic potion for the Rockets, which is Harden at the point. Look, they both can play off ball and score. They both can obviously play point, but the assumption here is obviously Chris is going to run the point and Harden's going to go back to off ball. And what we saw last year was that when he was in possession most of the time and when he ran the offense through him, that was the best success that they had.
Sarah, maybe I'm an idiot, but at first blush,
probably,
yeah. But at first blush, when I saw how this deal went down, on paper you look at it and you go, oh, Chris Paul, of course your team is better. But with Paul and Harden, two ball-dominant guys, two guys that love running the offense and getting up and down the floor, I'm skeptical as to how this is going to work. Because I'm with you. When you watched Houston last year in that Mike D'Antoni system, Harden was very comfortable making everything happen. When you've watched Chris Paul over the years, both in New Orleans and Los Angeles, he's the guy that likes making everything happen. I'm not so worried so much about the ego part of this, because I do believe that both these guys are pretty close and have got to know each other over the years. But from a basketball perspective, who's going to have the ball in their hands when the game is on the line? Who's the guy that D'Antoni's going to trust to get everybody else in rhythm? And if indeed, as we both think, that Paul becomes the point guard, how does Harden adjust to being the guy who doesn't have the ball in his hands all the time again? I mean, those are things, if you're Houston, that you have to take the risk of in adding a player like Chris Paul, but those are the things that would scare me as I was going into next year, knowing how reliant both guys have been in needing to have the ball in their hands to make things happen.
Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell filling in for Bomani on the right time today, talking about the Chris Paul trade to the Rockets. Micah Adams, who works in NBA content for ESPN Stats and Info, tweeted out today that Chris Paul's teams have played at a pace slower than league average in 10 of his 12 seasons, never inside the top 5. Now, of course, that's not Chris Paul necessarily dictating style. That's the coach, that's management, that's the rest of the teammates that he has. Do you think, Nick, that it's an effortless switch for him to transition from having one of the slower than league average almost every single year to switching to D'Antoni's system?
I don't think it'll be that tough, Sarah, just because when you talk to a bunch of different players around the league, they all tell you, especially the point guards, that they like playing fast. And I think that the envy that a lot of guys had last year in seeing the D'Antoni system yet again in the league, but seeing it work at such a high level with Harden, I think guys want to play like that. I think they enjoy getting their shots up. I think they enjoy getting their teammates involved. One of the most beautiful things about watching the Rockets play last season was the ball movement and getting everything in rhythm and getting quick shots up. When you have that ability for Chris Paul, a guy who hasn't been able to play the same way with Blake Griffin, with DeAndre Jordan over the last few years, with that core group with the Clippers, when you get that chance, I think it's going to liven him up a little bit. Again, my fear would be, though, that always both guys, Paul and Harden, have built careers on having the ball in their hands at all times. And now one of them
is an important distinction.
Yeah, very important. But now one of them's not going to have that pressure. Is it going to free each of them up in their own way? Or are there going to be times when the offense doesn't have the rhythm that it had last season when everything seemed to be up and running for Houston?
Michael Eaves from ESPN had some interesting thoughts about Chris Paul's departure from the Clippers. And I think over the last year plus, it's sort of been this ticking time bomb where we've said, for whatever reason, this iteration of the Clippers isn't getting it done. You like to look at it on paper. You think that they have a real chance to make some noise, and then it just never ends up working out. And for me, it was always that the Blake Griffin piece was going to be the best one to get rid of in terms of his style of play and the direction the NBA is going in. Despite him putting up good numbers, it felt like that would be the most obvious. Now the Clippers readjust their plan, and their focus is entirely on trying to keep Blake Griffin in-house. But Michael Eaves' point was that there was a relationship issue between Paul and Doc Rivers, and it had gradually been deteriorating, and it really, was a part of the reason that he felt confident in wanting to leave. And so several members of the team, according to Eaves, felt like Austin Rivers, Doc Rivers' son, was entitled because his dad was the coach and president of basketball ops, that he never really tried to fit in, that he got it easier than the rest of the guys, that Doc was less likely to criticize him. And the real sticking point, the straw that broke the camel's back for Chris Paul, particularly, as you mentioned, a guy being as smart as he is about league goings-on and trades and the CBA and everything else, how to put a team together, was a proposed trade that would have sent Carmelo Anthony to the Clippers last season, Melo and Sasha Vujacic in exchange for Jamal Crawford, Paul Pierce, and Austin Rivers. Doc ultimately said no to that, turned down the trade, and Chris Paul felt as though keeping Austin Rivers on the roster was then more important to him than the greater success of the team. And that lost his faith. And so that decision for Chris Paul was not only, listen, I can keep my bird rights and keep myself available for this 5-year, $200+ million deal, or 4-year, $150 if that's what he goes with. By going to the Clippers, by going to the Rockets, I can also get myself out of what appears to be a dead-end situation. And I think at this point, there was no other choice for him or for the Clippers than to shake something up in that team.
Well, they had to, Sarah. This team just wasn't good enough. Let's be honest. They've had chance after chance with the talent they've had in place, but the Doc and Chris Paul angle here is fascinating because in the beginning of that relationship and in the last few years, it always seemed like those two were always on the same page, that they knew what they needed from each other and they knew how they at least wanted to build the team. And so if that's the case, as Michael reported there, that there was some friction I mean, teams can't win when there's that kind of friction. When you don't have that trust in your head coach and you don't trust the front office, and in this case, Sarah, as you well know,
it's the same thing.
It's the same guy. When you don't have that trust, you have major, major problems. And so for any issues there might have been in the locker room because of that, maybe they did seep out on the floor. Now, I'm with Doc in this sense. In acquiring Carmelo, I don't know how much better you get. In fact, I'd make the argument you may not be that much better at all. But if the sticking point was, I don't want to let go of my son, absolutely that's going to have an impact on the locker room.
Incredibly
and it makes sense as to why Paul would want to be out of there.
Right. And also, I'm curious whether you think it's a good idea to have your coach also be the president of basketball ops. There are a few situations where I think you feel comfortable with that. But if things go wrong, or if you feel as though there's a disconnect there, that's a whole lot of power to be wielding.
When things are good and everybody's winning, Sarah, there's no problem. But
right.
those situations are few and far between.
And
when
it certainly
you have
was not the case with the Clippers from what we've seen so far. Speaking of situations going wrong, let's get into the Knicks. This was Straight Talk Wireless, nationwide coverage on America's largest and most dependable 4G LTE networks. Phil is gone, or as the internet is saying, bye, Felicia. That's coming up next. It's the right time on ESPN Radio. Welcome back to The Right Time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell sitting in for Bomani today. ESPN Radio is presented by Progressive Insurance. Last year, over 3 million drivers switched to Progressive. Call or click today and find out if you can save. We'll talk to Marc Spears from The Undefeated in a bit. We'll chat with Ramona Shelburne later in the show as well. Also, Mike Wise. So much NBA news today as the Clippers say goodbye to Chris Paul. The Knicks say goodbye to Phil Jackson. And Nick, you and I were hosting my show, Izzy in Spain, last night, talking about how the one time James Dolan decides to be a kind of stand-up guy and follow through on his promises. And I said I'm going to let Phil Jackson finish out his tenure. I'm not going to meddle with his decision-making. Was the worst time for him to be a stand-up guy and stick to his word, because it had become clear long ago that this was a toxic relationship and they needed to get rid of Phil. Well, this morning they did. He had 2 years left on the 5-year deal he initially signed in 2014, $12 million a year. He was averaging about $50,000 a day working for the Knicks, falling asleep while watching guys work out, hanging out a couple states away while his team was blowing up, antagonizing the star of the team and trying to force him out, and potentially floating the only good choice that was made during his tenure that he didn't agree with when they originally drafted Kristaps Porzingis. So I don't need to tell you, Nick, how much of a mess this tenure was, but I wonder, how do you, as someone who works in Chicago and works with the Bulls, as I'm a Chicago person, how do you balance the guy that we knew that won 11 titles as a coach with the guy that we've been presented with, by all accounts, as a GM? It just doesn't even seem like the same person.
So I think it's another reminder that front office executives have an extremely difficult job. And just because you're a great coach, or in Phil Jackson's case, one of the very best pro coaches in any sport of all time, it doesn't mean that the transition is going to be easy to being a front office person. And we've seen it time and again, but with Phil, people thought it was different because he was so adept at getting guys to check their egos at times. The Michael Jordans, the Scottie Pippens, in later years, Kobe and Shaq had success under Phil. You thought no matter what pops up in New York, Phil Jackson would be ready for it. And in the last couple of years, it just seems like nothing has worked. The Porzingis pick is the only thing that clicked, and even in the end, that's blown up in his face. So every time Phil tried to put something together, it just kept blowing up in a bad way for Knicks fans and the organization. And I think for all involved, Sarah, this was the move that had to be made, because it seemed like this relationship was already completely over with. The only thing that was keeping it together was the contract and the money that Phil wanted.
Right, and the promise that Dolan had made, which he now has figured out the better of. I think Trey Wingo put it best today. The best days of being a boat owner are the day you buy it and the day you sell it. The best days of Phil Jackson's tenure with the Knicks were the day they hired him, and everyone was excited, thinking they were bringing in the Zen Master, someone to turn around a franchise that's long been waiting for that title. And then today, when they say goodbye to him. And the only good day in between was the drafting of Porzingis, which at the time drew tons of boos and criticism. He ended up being a successful a player and a good choice, but even that was not Phil's choice. He didn't want Porzingis. Spike Lee also had a reaction today, posting a photo holding up his hands in thanks to God for finally ridding them of Phil Jackson. As I said, I don't need to tell you how bad they were, but these two stats will tell you something. I mentioned Micah Adams from ESPN Stats and Info. Over the last 3 years, Knicks won 29.5 fewer games than expected compared to Vegas preseason over-unders, the biggest underachievers by far over that span. So they did not put good use of their talent. And then 538 has an article about how much the Knicks overspent on their veterans. And they use something called their Carmelo projection system. And the 7 most significant players that Phil Jackson brought in or re-signed to New York: Carmelo Anthony, Derrick Rose, Joakim Noah, Aflalo, Lee, Lopez, and Calderon. They made or will make a combined $253 million from the 14-15 season to the end of the 19-20 season. Over the same time, they will have produced $134 million of value. So they overpaid by half on their veterans. And you and I know that when that rose and when the Noah deal, we were yelling across the country to the Knicks fans, don't get your hopes up. This is a terrible idea.
It's almost unbelievable, Sarah, when you start breaking down the numbers, not only what Phil gets paid and will now continue to get paid off that contract, but yeah, I mean, the Noah deal is going to go down as one of the very worst in NBA history. I mean, and Phil signed off on it. Phil made that happen. And there were a lot of other moves and contracts that weren't good. But this is why, again, you can't elevate these coaches, no matter how much success they've had, into some line of thinking where you go, all right, they're going to succeed in anything they do.
Well, some of them can. Some of them can. The problem is that, well, let's listen to Stephen A. Smith, because this morning on Mike and Mike, his point was that Phil was never cut out for this job and didn't even want it.
Phil Jackson never wanted the job. He had told confidants while laughing that this guy Dolan just keeps coming back, won't leave him alone. He started out at $6 million, went up to $7 million, then $8 million, then $10 million. Phil finally got to a point where he said, I can't say no to the money. That's what this was always about. It was never about doing the job. It was about getting paid while doing one job and one job above all else. And that was giving cover to James Dolan, who was feeling the heat, so much so that people literally were planning on boycotting and protesting outside the corridors on the streets of Madison Square Garden.
Right. So, I mean, he just kept throwing money at him until he said, all right, fine, I'll take it. So he was never fully invested in it, at least according to Stephen A's opinion. And we saw even early on there were questions about, why isn't he around? You know, why isn't Phil there living in New York day to day, being a part of this team's operations? And so I think you're right. There's certainly coaches that we can't presume will be successful, but we've seen coaches move on to front office and be successful. This seemed like it just never fit.
And Sarah, my question after listening to Stephen A's commentary, and it would go towards Phil too, how much money is enough? I mean, didn't this guy already have tens of millions of dollars based on what he had done for the Bulls, winning all those titles with Michael Jordan, and then going to the Lakers and winning all those titles with Kobe and Shaq? I mean, how much is enough to not dent, or in this case, severely hammer your legacy? I mean, how much do you think now he regrets even taking the calls and going through the motions of the last couple of years?
Right, and we'll discuss later what we really think about his intentions with that job and how it's affected his legacy. But you're right. At this point, obviously, both he and the Knicks fans especially would like to erase the entire tenure. Handcrafted, Nick. It's all the rage. from flour press soap to homemade hot sauce to artisanal pickles, whatever the heck those are. Well, Firestone Complete Auto Care is glad that handcrafted is catching on because they've been handcrafting repairs since 1926, and their 4,000 ASC certified technicians work hard every day to help keep cars running like new. Before people were making organic greeting cards and rock jewelry in their basements, Firestone Complete Auto Care has been hard at work in the garage, tightening, torquing, wrenching, and they back up that work with their fixed right promise, guaranteeing your car is fixed right, your repair is priced right, and the work is completed right on time. Keep your car running newer, longer. When the road gets rough, you need a set of tires that can get tough. So right now, at Firestone Complete Auto Care, get $60 by mail on a Visa prepaid card when you buy a set of 4 eligible Firestone tires. Whatever you drive, drive a Firestone. Offer valid now through July 9th. Prepaid card is issued by the Bancorp Bank pursuant to a license from Visa USA, Inc. and may be used everywhere. Visa debit cards are accepted. The Bancorp Bank, member FDIC, expiration applies. The Undefeated's Mark Stein coming up next on The Right Time.
You're listening to Love Advice with Leanne. Caller, you're on the air.
Hi, Leanne. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Why, in your professional opinion, do you never take my calls off the air?
Is this Carl?
Yep, it's Carl. I mean, we had a few dates. Everything was great. I thought,
Well, when you switch to Geico, you could save a lot of money on car insurance.
Okay, awesome.
You should call them.
I will.
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
Welcome back to The Right Time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. This is The Right Time and the wrong hosts. Bomani Jones is out, Sarah Spain and Nick Friedell filling in. You can always tweet us on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed. Guests join us on the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line. Nick, don't forget this Saturday, exclusively on ESPN and ESPN Deportes, it's the Battle of Brisbane. Manny Pacquiao will defend his WBO welterweight title live as he aims for his 60th career win, facing Australia's undefeated #1 world-rated contender, Jeff Horn. The Battle of Brisbane this Saturday, July 1st at 10 Eastern, exclusively on ESPN, ESPN Deportes, and the ESPN app. Let's go to the Shell Pennzoil Performance Line, where the undefeated's Marc Spears joins us. Thanks for making time for us, Mark.
I know, y'all interrupting this penalty shootout between Portugal and Chile.
You're not the only one watching that. The control room is abuzz with the tension.
Oh, okay.
Let us. Feel free to interrupt any answer you have with a long, extended call of goal. We'll grade you. We'll grade you on it.
I'm glad America's paying attention now a little bit.
Right. I guess. All right, so let's start with Chris Paul. He and his bird rights are headed to Houston. Clippers get a bunch of guys back in the deal, and Paul gets to be eligible to re-sign in the summer of 2018 for that 5-year, $205 million deal if he wants. We talked about it earlier. Chris Paul's teams have played at a slower than league average pace in 10 of his 12 seasons, never inside of the top 5. How do you see his transition into D'Antoni's offense?
Well, one thing I think that is attractive to what Chris saw in Houston, believe it or not, is seeing James Harden play point guard. He likes playing off the ball, and I think especially now as he's getting a little older in his career, and he and James are basically going to be co-point guards. They'll be sharing it, and it gives Chris a chance to be more dangerous offensively, and so I guess you kind of got to pick your poison offensively and really not know who's going to lead the offense from time to time, because they're both going to be, from what Chris expects, from what I was told, expected to have point guard duties. And he considered San Antonio, but I think the up and down of what's going on with LaMarcus Aldridge perhaps hurt the Spurs. Is he going to be there? Is he not? I think that played a role. Also, keep in mind, I think he and Tony Parker are good friends. Maybe that played a role in it as well. But I think it was more the LaMarcus thing. And obviously, with the Clippers, if you want to beat Golden State, that's probably the last place in the league that seems to have a chance at doing that. They've been drilled at by Golden State the last couple of years. So I think with that, his relationship with Harden, relationship with two former teammates, Bobby Brown and Trevor Ariza, who played with him with him at the New Orleans Hornets, he thought Houston was the best place to be.
Mark, speaking of relationships, at the end of Chris's tenure with the Clippers,
man, you can't just start talking and what's up, man?
How you doing?
You got to come in with this.
Take
I
him to
my
dinner
voice was
first,
deep,
Nick.
Man, you coming in here all deep and everything. We having a deep off.
Yeah, this is like Barry White's. Should I talk like this?
Yeah, you're always going to knock me off in that one. But
all right,
I'm glad to
got
see you're doing well. It's good to hear you. But when we go through the breakdown here of how Paul has ended up in Houston, how much of an impact was his relationship with Doc Rivers in the deterioration of it in some circles? How much did that factor into what's happened now?
Well, Michael Eaves had some really, really interesting stuff to say about it, and on his Facebook post, and he covered the Clippers as a television host for several years, so he's certainly familiar with what's going on with the Clippers, and I think he people close to Chris kind of beg to differ on what's said. I had never known that Doc and CP had a big issue over his son, but Michael Eaves put it out there. There's got to be some kind of truth to it. So I think ultimately it was what I was told at the end of the regular season was Chris wants to be at a place where he could win, and I don't know that the Clippers were that place anymore. Blake Griffin can leave, and they haven't been able to do anything in the playoffs for a while. So I think he felt like if he's going to make a change, now was the time to do it.
Talking to Marc Spears of the Undefeated on the Shell Penzo Performance Line, things are getting a little savage for DeAndre Jordan, who, of course, was kidnapped by Paul and Griffin and other Clippers players to make him stay in L.A.
Right? He should be bad.
They demanded his loyalty, and now
can I tell
Paul is gone.
That it kind of reminded me of?
Right.
When I was covering the Nuggets, I remember this crazy story where Antonio McDyess was sequestered by the Nuggets as a free agent in the old McNichols Arena in the snow, with the snow going outside, and the Suns had a limo with Jason Kidd in it and Rex Chapman, and they're all trying to convince McDyess to come back to Phoenix. And Dan Issel had told the security to not let them into the Pepsi Center. Into the McNichols Arena. They couldn't buy a ticket or anything to not let them in.
Wow.
And so Nick Van Exel convinced McDyess to return to the Nuggets, sign a long-term deal. Well, in the midst of that long-term deal, Van Exel asked to be traded.
Oof. And
he ended up being traded to the Dallas Mavericks. And years later, I talked to Van Exel, and he told me that one of the several regrets during his interesting career in the NBA, but the one that perhaps was on top of that list was asking for a trade after he had convinced McDyess to stay there.
Yeah.
And that kind of reminded me of this, where those guys fought and clawed and went to Dallas or Houston, or where I think they were in Houston, and Cuban was outside trying to knock on the door and to convince him to stay, and then they both could end up leaving him.
Yeah.
Mark, as we figure out where the Clippers go from here, in the last few weeks there's been so much chatter about LeBron potentially ending up in L.A., whether it was with the Clippers or with the Lakers. How do you think this move that the Clippers have now made impacts what they may be able to do next summer in potentially going after LeBron?
Well, I think that the Lakers are still the more attractive option. To me, with all due respect to the Clippers, I can't see LeBron in a Clippers uniform. He'd probably want to have the mystique of being a Laker, all the championships, the statues outside. I wrote that the first Clippers statue might be Chris Paul, and maybe that's in jeopardy now after this decision. But if LeBron's going there, it's got to be to the Lakers, and the Lakers seem to be putting themselves in a position, salary cap space wise, to bring LeBron and possibly Paul George, who wants to be there. So next summer could be more interesting than an already crazy summer this year, and I wouldn't be totally surprised if that ended up being the case.
Thanks for making time for us, Mark. Good stuff, and we'll keep you up to date on the latest people being held hostage and otherwise.
All right, have a dog for me in Chicago.
Back to the right time on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Bomani Jones letting Nick Friedell and me, Sarah Spain, take the reins for the day. Well, I don't think he's letting us. He probably doesn't even know who's hosting. He's probably on a beach somewhere hanging out. But we are filling in. We're presented by Progressive Insurance. Hit us up on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed at Sarah Spain, at Nick Friedell. Quick update, Nick, on the Big Three tournaments. This is a bunch of old dudes getting back together to play some hoop. And not surprisingly, the first week of it ended with some very serious injuries. A lot of these guys out of shape, haven't played in a while, and the competitive fire was there, but perhaps not the physical ability any longer. Jason Williams, White Chocolate, set to miss 6 to 8 months after suffering a knee injury in that opening game of the Big Three. It was near the end of his team's game. Corey Maggette also injured in the opening week. He had surgery for a leg injury, no timetable for his return. This was a conference call with Ice Cube and the Big Three co-founder today. That's where they announced these injuries. They also talked about a couple rule changes that have already gone. It was like the beta version was that first iteration out in New York. 15,000 fans showed up. By all accounts, it was a success in terms of the in arena product. A lot of people wondering, how it will work out as a taped delay event that will be played on Sundays and run on Mondays on TV. But they also announced that some rule changes will occur. They learned their lesson. It was over an hour extra to get the 4 games done each day. So they're cutting it back from 60 points that games will be played to 50. Halftime hits when the first team reaches 25 points. So hopefully that'll move it along. It took something like 5.5 hours to get through the games that first week.
Oh, man. Sarah, when I first heard about the Big Three, it made me think of days gone by in the XFL. And you just hope, for the athlete's sake in this case, that there aren't too many more injuries. But with the advanced age on a lot of these guys, from a basketball playing perspective, and the fact that, sure, a lot of these guys have been playing pickup, I have no doubt, for several years. But playing pickup and playing in this kind of environment, that is very difficult to maintain over time. And you wish the best for any league starting out, but I can't say I'm very interested in what I've seen to date.
I like the idea of it, but the thing that stood out to me the most about that opening week is that Allen Iverson's the most exciting guy out there, and he was, I think, 2 points on 1 for 6 shooting, and he's technically a player manager, player coach. We're not going to see a ton of him. You're going to get a lot more of the Kwame Browns than you are the Allen Iversons. And that's no besmirching of his great name, but I think we all know what people were there to see. And I think as it gets, a war of attrition as far as injury goes, it might be less and less exciting as they try to continue what's expected to be 10 weeks. We'll see if they have enough players to keep going that long. Let's get back to the Clippers and the Rockets deal today. It's interesting because as we talked about, Michael Eaves' report said that Paul was kind of itching to get out, in part because obviously they've struggled to have the success that they'd hoped for, also because of a deteriorating relationship with Doc Rivers, mainly because of that Doc and Austin Rivers relationship. But also Ramona Shelburne tweeted out, want to know Jerry West's influence on the Clippers. You're seeing it. He was not in favor of the just bring everyone back plan. So I wonder, do you think that even though the Clippers knew that they were going to lose Paul, that they still were maybe not so hurt about this all going down this way, that they're okay with him heading out?
I think they had to know, Sarah. I mean, Steve Ballmer, the owner, has been in charge now for the last few years, but very clearly he's putting more of his stamp on the team. And when you're watching a team that has talent, but it just can't get over the hump, then any businessman or businesswoman is looking at that saying, well, maybe it's time for me to make some changes. And I think that's what we've seen here. For so many years it was, well, we trust in Doc to figure it out and to get this going in the right direction and to deliver a championship. And it just hadn't worked out for the Clippers. So I don't blame Steve Ballmer for bringing Jerry West in. I don't blame West for at least making his feelings known on the fact that he didn't think they were good enough. And Sarah, if you're not good enough in any pro sport, but especially in the NBA, the worst place you can be is towards the middle. And that's right where the Clippers were as far as getting over the hump in the postseason. So I don't blame them for trying to start fresh. I'm very curious to see what happens now, though, with Blake Griffin.
Yeah, and Ramona, of course, pointed out that yes, they are now, reconvening and putting all their efforts towards keeping Griffin around. I don't know if he might feel the same way that Paul does, that now's the time to start fresh and go somewhere else and see if he can create some magic elsewhere.
Yeah, I just don't think that talent was ever going to be enough. And if you're Paul, at this point, you got to try.
Coming up, how much does Phil's tenure in New York affect his legacy? We'll get into that next. It's The Right Time on ESPN Radio.